What is beauty and why should we care? Have you ever stopped to think about that? Well, there are two reasons for thinking about or trying to understand beauty. One, beauty is a very powerful thing and it's not trivial or something that artists subjectively think about. And we should try to understand powerful things. Beauty is very important for our ethics, creativity, culture, design, science, the life around us. And these powerful things affect our life and destiny. It makes sense that we should try to understand them. But also, and this is very interesting, beauty frequently works from the shadows of individuality, from the gaps in our understanding, from our approximate thinking, and not so closely linked to our knowledge. Well, sometimes we assume it is. It is linked to our knowledge or our illusion of knowledge. And it has all these tensions. Where is beauty? Well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but we say this object or that object is beautiful. Is this beautiful? What about this or this? As you try to evaluate the beauty of these objects, think about what makes it beautiful. Why are you saying that this object or that object is beautiful? If beauty is such a powerful force in designing our lives, individually and collectively, as people, as groups, but also as members, as individuals, then we should try to figure out why it is to be modeled this way. I will try to do in these coming sections is get a few ideas about beauty, a few definitions, not because the definitions are important, but because they will point us in the direction of identifying a few of the elements or the factors that define or determine what we judge as beautiful. We will look at beauty in science. We will look at how a few historical figures have tried to define that, but we can also look at it in the arts. And we will look at beauty in the world itself, in the natural world and in our cultural world. How does it affect creativity and design? And then we'll try to make sense of that. And I will argue that many of the factors that define beauty are shared group factors, and that beauty itself as a concept will keep on changing as we change the symbols of our daily life and as we change our environment continuously. So how much can we know about beauty? How much can we understand beauty? I will start from two historical examples, one of them very historical. So starting from Plato talked about these ideals, about the forms, the perfect eternal essences. And beauty was one of these. Beauty, in a sense, as a form, is something perfect, eternal, transcendent. So beauty for Plato, and it was Socrates speaking, is something that can lift the soul upwards. So we can think of this like a ladder, and you can start with the beauty, the love, appreciation of a material object, to the love of minds, ideas, laws, and finally the appreciation of beauty as a divine form itself. So interestingly here, beauty is not subjective. Right? It is objective reality. It is something that's very ontological in itself. It just draws us towards truth. And I want to add a definition from Kant. Kant talks about disinterested pleasure when he talks about beauty. And here we have moved from this idea of the objective to something that shows the tension more. So it has to be subjective, but it has a universal feel to it. And Kant always insisted on this universal significance of something. So beauty arises from a harmonious play between imagination and understanding. Beauty is also present in science, even in mathematics. And Dirac talks about this when he talks about equations. And sometimes he says, well, it's more important for equations to be beautiful. How can equations be beautiful? How can science be beautiful? And then here we talk about elegance. We talk about a certain capacity to say a lot with a little. So there is a hidden simplicity in this elegance, in this beauty of equations. And that is an element of surprise. I know, to me it feels like, can we say, translucent intensity. So you say a little, but it hides so much. There is a whole world sitting behind this remarkable equation, as Feynman says. We can also look at definitions of beauty from cognitive science, where People actively try to define this. And look at a few of them. Beauty is a pleasurable experience that arises from the perception of pattern, proportion, meaningful form. Another says, beauty is the experience of reward elicited by specific combinations of perceptual, cognitive, and affective features. Or beauty is the capacity of an object to invite and sustain a form of reflective pleasure. Beauty is a value judgment based on a perception of an object's capacity. And I think here it would be interesting for us to differentiate between beauty as a quality of an object versus an experience. Some objects have the ability to evoke these experiences, and here we can differentiate between beauty and aesthetic perception. So aesthetics started with the simple idea of the gratification of the senses, but then it included things like gratification of thinking, grasping, understanding, and we'll see some interesting links here. Some cognitive scientists talk about processing fluency, and the idea here is that things that are easier for us to understand, that we can process more easily, are interpreted as being more beautiful. This explains further ideas that we associate with beauty. Things like symmetry, things like familiarity. And we'll talk more about these. Others have talked about this phenomenon called the peak shift effect. So there are certain stimuli that we would like to see exaggerated, right? Huge eyes, colors, and there were some experiments where birds preferred certain eggs to their own because they were more colorful, even though they were fake. An important point to note here is that beauty has neural correlates, so people can detect the perception of beauty in the brain. And here we can say that beauty, or the aesthetic insight, is a kind of a cognitive resonance. Something lights up in our head. We detect a certain pattern. We see something that was hidden, and we interpret that as a feeling of beauty. So beauty is neurologically is a dopaminergic feedback loop, right? We seek certain patterns, we like to resolve certain ambiguities, and we feel joy. And there are cognitive studies that show that pattern recognition, analogical thinking, and the integration of certain distant concepts is interpreted as a perception of beauty in our mind. So there's this idea of cognitive insight, understanding, and beauty all coming together. And so all of this discussion points us in the direction of elements, certain factors that we consider essential to evaluating beauty. Symmetry, like symmetrical things. The average. Some studies have shown that people prefer the average, the prototype of something. Easy. We want things to be easy for us to understand. Right? Our brains are lazy, in a sense. But we also want a degree of novelty in that peak shift. So give me this prototype, but give me the prototype with something beautiful. And this directly goes into creativity. Patterns, fluency, and coherence are very important factors to consider in any kind of creative work. So we define some of these factors, as many as they are, as many as we could. And now we can look at some of the darker, the more mysterious, the more imaginative aspects of beauty. When we talked about the awareness aspect, the knowledge aspect of beauty, we tried to define a few variables. We looked at definitions from philosophy, ideas from cognitive science, and it's as if we tried to pin it down to certain specifics, to an understanding of neural pathways, neurological responses. But in a sense, beauty has always had this mysterious element to it, this transcendent element to it. And after modernism, we started moving further towards this point of shadow, darkness, lack of clarity, obscurity that reflects unspecified nature of beauty. So let's look at the evolution of art in a sense. In classicism, in ancient Greece, beauty was about proportion, something being proper, something being measured. There were some canons of ideal human proportions, for example, and a certain set of ratios was used in architecture, in sculpture, in painting, and these were thought to reflect mathematical harmony. Renaissance thinkers reflected this, and this is obvious in Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, in Botticelli's The Birth of Venus, for example. But as we move towards Romanticism, there was a certain move away from these specific forms, these objective ideals, into a further appreciation of individuality, of emotion, of mystery, and what anchored romantic thinkers to a more objective, somehow, to a more objective conception of beauty was nature, the sublime. So this was out there, but still there were individual interpretations, the individual's understanding of this great, sublime, natural, sometimes horrific, scary forces, but it was considered to be beautiful. And this idea of a classical restraint, of full control, it was as if it was rejected, right? Because nature is out there, it's beautiful and powerful and scary. But this movement towards more subjectivity, emotion, intensified further. And in the modern age, it is as if we have, or we are moving away from this concept of beauty altogether. So, ugly is beautiful. Or, in a sense, beauty is always being redefined, because what we agreed on as beautiful, as a group, cannot be valid for long periods of time, because somebody else will come and try to redefine this beauty with a new sense of individuality, remixing of symbols, and so on. Can we say that beauty is not important anymore, is being neglected, or we are just seeing all these new pluralistic different forms of beauty? Because beauty now is emergent. It is something that depends on a very particular situation. In art also, we can talk about moments of creative insight as reflecting beauty and linking creativity and beauty, because they both involve these concepts of structure plus surprise. We talked about elegance. And insight occurs when the mind reshapes a certain problem or a space, when the mind revisits a certain problem and sees a hidden connection, sees a pattern somewhere. And this idea of aesthetic appreciation is like our brain's reward for solving a problem. Good, you solved it, here, feel happy. Aesthetic beauty is a reward for exploring the unknown. To me, what motivated me to think more about beauty, to try to look at its meaning, was this beautiful image of the elves in Tolkien's work. And I thought that it was really beautiful how he portrayed the elves as these creatures that always longed for this form of beauty that was being lost, that was being diminished. He says, well, there is a nostalgic element, a longing. And the beauty in the case of the elves is a reflection of light from another world. In a sense, look at what Tolkien says about this when describing the beauty of the elves. Well, their faces were fair, fairer than any face seen in the mortal world. Yet it was not only form that made them beautiful, but the light that lingered about them. This light that comes from somewhere else. It's a reflection from other worlds. And here, you can see that this is Plato's idea of beauty as a form being reflected from somewhere else. So it is this idea of a mirror, but it has a sad component. And we'll see this sadness somewhere else. But it has this sad component because beauty itself is fleeting, is fading, the joy is being diminished. And these ideas of nostalgia and sadness and reflection of the light from the other world is somehow faint. Right? It's faint and it's fleeting and fading. So these ideas about beauty being dark, mysterious, not completely graspable, complete the tension with what we discussed previously about trying to define it, trying to pin it down, to link it to certain properties. And next, I want to look at beauty in the world, in the natural world, and in our cultural and designed world. After talking about beauty in philosophy, in the arts, in the sciences, and in all of these there were hints of a more natural, primal sense of appreciation of aesthetics and beauty. And here we can look at beauty in the world, and I want to look at that through two lenses, one in nature and two in design and in culture. So from the perspective of evolutionary biology, we said that beauty is sometimes considered to be a form of fitness. It is a sign of health. It is a signal. The beautiful flower, the colorful flower, we can link that to exaggerated features that reflect health, that reward the passerby for understanding a certain pattern. And this was something that Darwin thought about. Why is the peacock beautiful? If we look at things from the perspective of natural selection and survival of the fittest, then surely the peacock's tail is not something that will help their survival out there in the wild, right? If there are predators, it doesn't help if you have this huge flashy tail. And then other evolutionary biologists, other scientists thought about this. And Zahavi says, well, display of exuberance, this unreasonable exuberance, is actually an honest sign of fitness, right? Because if I can afford this beautiful, amazing tail and still survive, then I must be really powerful. This has interesting parallels within human society, display of exuberance. And so within evolutionary biology, in nature, symmetry itself also is seen as a signal of beauty. And there are studies on this. People seem to think that symmetrical faces are more beautiful, and this has evolutionary biology roots because symmetry is seen as a sign of health. The more healthy you are, the more symmetric you are. This can be linked to something else. Some studies show that people prefer faces that are close to the average, so somehow prototypical. Again, this is a sign of regressing towards symmetry, towards the mean, and linking it to health. Familiarity can be linked in a similar way, but there is always the tension here. The tension between similarity, being prototypical, being average, symmetrical, but also the deviation, because beauty is always an interplay between the standard and the deviation. And as we said, certain qualities sometimes, when they are exaggerated, become signs of beauty. So it becomes about finding this balance in design. And I found this beautiful paper by Hecker, and it tries to summarize some principles of aesthetic pleasure, but by looking at the field of design. And it so happens that he does this by reflecting on the evolutionary biology roots of all of this. And I think that these 4 principles are quite interesting, quite telling, and they encapsulate many of the ideas that we've been discussing through the different fields. So let's look at these principles of aesthetic pleasure. 1, maximum effect for minimum means. Okay, this has to do with this concept of elegance. And sometimes what is perceived as beautiful is that which is compact, yet has a lot of expressive power. For example, the economy in expressing something with the smallest number of symbols or signs. This is the very definition of elegance in Arabic literature. Under this idea of maximum effect, minimum means, there are a number of principles that support it. 1, metaphor. Metaphor is very important for design, very important in creativity, but it works because it empowers this idea, this principle. Metaphor links something to something else and then connects this sign with many meanings in the viewer's mind, right? And there is this other concept of conjunctive ambiguity. So something isn't very clear, and it's not very clear on purpose, because when different people see this same sign, they interpret it in different ways. And so here again, there is this power, this intensity of expressiveness through a minimal number of signs. Other principles, well, I thought that this was the most important, the most powerful principles, but there are other principles like finding unity in variety. Finding unity in variety is about finding the pattern, the moment of insight. It's about abstraction. So we look at this big set of things and we see what connects them. We see the higher truth, Plato and Tolkien. And as we do that, there is this idea of abstraction that still encapsulates or reflects what is behind it, and what is behind it is all these different meanings. The third principle is something that was championed by a person who is a great figure in design, Lowy, and he talks about something being most advanced yet acceptable, or what he called Maya. And this was a very impactful and, I would say, creative designer. The idea here is that for something to be perceived as beautiful, it has to be somehow prototypical, the yet acceptable part, but it would be most advanced, so kind of challenging, deviating from the norm as much as possible, so that it is still being perceived as acceptable, as belonging to a category, as prototypical, as beautiful in terms of this variable that we agree on. And here, as we said, beauty again is this interplay between stability and change. And the final quality is optimal match, and that is about the agreement on the different qualities of the components that have to be congruent. The main idea here is that these design principles seem to reflect the same concepts that are present in all the different aspects through which we saw beauty. In science, in philosophy, in the arts, in nature itself. It is about simplicity, elegance, yet hiding so much. It is about this interplay between the subjective and the objective, and this tension between the different yet the same. So to close this discussion in a self-referential way, I'd like to go back to the two questions we started with. One, what is beauty? So, is this beautiful? What about this? Or this? Think about some of the meanings that we've explored, some of the elements that we've determined as important components of the aesthetic experience. Think about familiarity, appropriateness, the average, communicability, even economy in expression, where we have one symbol containing other meanings. Where do all these come from? Obviously, these are things that we are used to. These are reflections of our environment. What does this mean? These are things that we have been adapted to, in a sense. And so these are elements of our culture. These are things instilled in us as members of a particular group. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, just because it happens to be the thing we see the most. I grew up seeing these things, and they become more familiar, and they become an essential part of my definition of beauty. There are different groups we belong to. Some of these groups we belong to naturally. They just happen to be around us. This is my neighbor and my neighbor's neighbor. And some groups we choose to belong to. These are groups that represent our passions, that represent our interests and hobbies, and so on. So the common meanings that are part of our everyday life end up defining our sense of beauty, our sense of aesthetics, our sense of appreciation. And remember, in some sense, beauty is truth visualized or truth material. This is very important. Some of these common meanings, cultural meanings, group variables, reflect what they are. They are preferences of a particular group of people. But think also about the universal patterns behind all this. Can we just say that the common meanings, the group meanings, the cultural meanings are just reflections of particular instances of these universal patterns? So there is this even higher level of abstraction out there that connects all these higher levels of abstraction that we have as preferences for beauty. So why care about all this? Well, we said that beauty is this powerful reward system. It works on groups, but it also works on individuals. And I find it very helpful to reflect on these factors and variables and psychological forces that drive our everyday life, especially our motivators. These elements that shape our world, when we reflect on them, we kind of gain this power, this moment of intent, where we become more creative and participate more in shaping our own destiny. Beauty is a connector of the daily with the transcendent. And it reflects this mystical light, remember. But I think it is a blessing that it keeps changing all the time. This motivator that drives culture, science, arts, aesthetics, philosophy, thinking, architecture, our environment keeps changing all the time, as we saw. And this is a blessing. Culture keeps changing because creative people keep adding to it. And symbols are always being reshuffled and recombined. And this is good because it keeps the cycles of creativity running. And this makes everything richer. And this creates more opportunities to see the reflected light.